Summer is coming early for the Seattle Seahawks, but not until they wrapped up their second mandatory minicamp practice today, and it was led by a talented cornerback group flexing their muscles. We're going to be diving in on everything that went down at the VMAC to cap off the spring off-season up next year on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang, and a special thanks to all the 12s that are tuning in, whether you're listening in nearby Tumwater, Washington, or in Las Vegas, Nevada. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. The Seahawks wrapping up their mandatory minicamp. Yes, that's right. They will only be having 2 practices. Mike Macdonald deciding to bypass the third one on Thursday, but still plenty of action that went down at the VMAC. Rob and I are going to be diving into some key takeaways coming out of the final practice of the spring season as we now head into the dark, dark days of the summer in the NFL. And we're going to have plenty more observations that we'll be dishing out along the way on today's show, which is brought your way by our friends over at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Now for your lead story here on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Going into this offseason program, there's been plenty of questions for the Seahawks on defense. You got a new defensive-minded head coach with a complex scheme in Mike Macdonald, new defensive coordinator in Aden Durde, and a number of new coaches, Carl Scott being the only holdover from Pete Carroll's staff. But one of the expectations for this group was that the cornerback group was going to be a strength for this football team. And I will just say this, Rob, you were not in attendance at today's practice, but you got to watch all the turnovers that happened yesterday. Today, the cornerback group again was at it, creating turnovers in bunches. And even though he didn't have one of the interceptions that counted, the ringleader behind all of this, a player that really looks like he belongs on the Legion of Boom roster, back in 2013 to 2014 is Devon Witherspoon. He just fits that mold with how chatty he is, the way that he backs it up on the field, the aggressive nature, how teammates flock to him, and the instincts. As Mike Macdonald said, he wanted to make sure, hey, are you going to be making sure Devon Witherspoon actually hears this? But some interesting comments from Mike Macdonald on where Witherspoon's IQ stacks up with some of the other players that he's had the privilege of coaching.
Yeah, it's high. It's high for a second-year guy to be able to take something from the meeting, register it quickly. The questions he asks are really spot on. Like, they're really no BS type questions. Like, he understands the concept. He understands, like, okay, he's playing you can tell he's visualizing himself going through all the rules. When it's clear, he's good. When it's not, he nails it, and then, takes it right to the field. So, yeah, it's pretty high.
As Macdonald was talking about in his final press conference of the spring off-season practices, this is a sport where you have to have certain personalities, Rob, to be able to capture championships. It has to be a player-led culture. The coaches can only take the team so far. And now in his second season, Devon Witherspoon looks to me like a player that is emerging as one of those leaders for this football team that all the other players are gravitating to. Maybe the offensive players get tired of him chatting every single play, but he is making everybody around him better. He had an incredible near interception today where he showed off that football IQ, coming off of his receiver in the end zone, going over and swatting the ball away from DK Metcalf and tumbling in the back of the end zone, nearly got both feet down in bounds, and he did catch the ball. John Schneider was sitting over at one of their big TV screens that they have over on the side, looking up, and all you could see was just this huge smile after watching the replay of that. And it's understandable, not just with Witherspoon, with this entire cornerback group.
Yeah, that's well said. I think that when the Seahawks made the selection, Devon Witherspoon, number 5 overall a year ago, Corbin, and they moved him inside to the nickel cornerback spot, a spot that only in the last decade or so has really become essentially viewed as a starting position. Then there was a lot of question marks out there. It was like, did the Seahawks really make the smart move there? And, we said in yesterday's show, or I said in yesterday's show, that I thought that DK Metcalf was the best player on the field, and that he looked like he was, basically ready to hit the ground running, like it was the beginning of the regular season. Devon Witherspoon, to me, is the counterpart to that on the defensive side of the ball. Just the way that he moves, and the way that, not just athletically, the way that he moves, but where he moves and when he makes the moves. You can see the instincts, even though this is non-contact drills, just with the way that he closes in on the football. I love the fact that you just mentioned the interception today, and the fact that he was not on his primary read and was able to get off of that and still make the play. The fact that you've cited the other cornerbacks as well. Rick Woolen getting an interception, Artie Burns having an interception, Mike Jackson returned one for a touchdown. The rookie DJ James in yesterday's practice, and if I read your article right, Nehemiah Pritchett had a pass breakup of his own. So the Auburn rookies making their plays.
Yep.
It's very exciting about what we are seeing here from this cornerback room that, as you said, Carl Scott was the only holdover of Pete Carroll's staff previously, and that the secondary is continuing to be a real strength for this club, considering the way the NFL is, of course, shifting to passing offenses. If Seattle's secondary can play this well, then that's going to help a pass rush that looks pretty damn dynamic as well. So again, there's an awful lot of optimism about the defense and the playmaking ability that they are showing. I think that is the biggest reason why Mike Macdonald felt so comfortable in basically giving the guys the day off, an early break into summer vacation, as you said it, just because that's a bold decision. This is a club that has a brand new head coach, obviously has new coaches on either side, and an awful lot of new talent, veterans and rookies. So to give them the day, take away a day that you had to practice together, I think just kind of speaks to the confidence that Mike Macdonald and his coaches feel right now about the fact that these players, and arguably led as much by Devon Witherspoon as anybody, that to give them this opportunity. So again, I think the Seahawks fans have got to be excited about the optimism that the Seahawks clearly are feeling about themselves right now as well.
If there's a reason that Mike Macdonald should be bullish on this defense being able to take a big step forward, you can point to the defensive line, and we've talked about that group. But this cornerback group, just to put in perspective the depth we're talking about here, when Mike Jackson intercepted a screen today, when he jumped a screen, he read it before Sam Howell even took the snap. When he picked that pass off and had nothing but green in front of him, he was playing with the third team defense as one of their outside cornerbacks. I mean, that's the type of depth that we're talking about here. Mike Jackson has started 21 games the last couple of years, and he's played at a pretty high level when he's had those opportunities. So you got to see that. Artie Burns he's probably like 7th or 8th on the depth chart, and he had a really nice interception today where he jumped a crossing route, middle of the field, and picked it off. You mentioned DJ James yesterday. Nehemiah Pritchett today, I know he didn't intercept it, but it was arguably a more impressive play going up against Derek Young around the goal line, and was able to, without making contact, staying within the rules of minicamps, OTAs, tempo, was able to get his hand out and get the football knocked away. And so you've seen the rookies respond. They have embraced this competition. You've got players like Artie Burns. I mean, Kobe Bryant's been playing zero corner because there's nowhere to put him at this point. So that's the kind of depth that we are talking about here, and it's really exciting. But the big thing that was hammered home today, just listening to Leonard Williams and some of the other players that were raving about Devon Witherspoon's energy and what he brings to this football team. When Mike Jackson returned to that interception for a touchdown, who was the first guy screaming, running down the field to meet him? He was coming off the sideline. It was Devon Witherspoon. That's the kind of player that every great defense has got to have. And so he's in year 2. He's still a young pup at 23 years of age, and yet it feels like he is taking that leadership role here that the Seahawks badly need one of these young guys to step up and take. He is grabbing that bull by the horns, just the way that he loves playing the run and chasing after quarterbacks as a blitzer.
Yeah, and again, you mentioned that Devon Witherspoon was the very first one to go down there and congratulate Mike Jackson. I saw the same thing yesterday with the corner that we were kind of remiss in not mentioning, Trey Brown, who of course made arguably the best, or at least the most impressive play I saw on the ball from a defensive back in yesterday's practice. And that, of course, was the one we talked about yesterday, where it was a beautifully thrown ball by Geno Smith to DK Metcalf, and Trey Brown's the one that goes up and gets the football and kind of tips it to himself and is able to wrestle the ball away. I mean, it was a heck of a play. And again, he was able to kind of weave his way back to score the touchdown. But again, it was Devon Witherspoon who was the first to celebrate that. So I think you're making an excellent point here that the Seahawks needed somebody on defense to kind of take the mantle as the leader. It certainly looks like Devon Witherspoon is up to the task right now of doing that. And so that is an exciting storyline when it's your best player, arguably your best player at least, that is also your most passionate. That is what you that's what you're hoping for. That's, to me, is exactly what John Schneider, basically made his decision to take him number 5 overall. This is exactly what he was hoping for. That's why he had that big smile, as you mentioned before.
Yeah, he was beaming ear to ear, and it's understandable because that was an incredible near interception that he had there. And I will just say this, I've been sitting on this for a while just with what we saw last year, but this is where I stand on what Devon Witherspoon can be. This is, to me, the ceiling that we are looking at, Rob. I think you are looking at a hybrid of Richard Sherman, Cam Chancellor, and Earl Thomas. I know that sounds crazy, but think about it. He's got the ball skills and the instincts of a Richard Sherman. He's got the speed. He's got the athleticism, the playmaking ability of Earl Thomas, and we know he thumps people like Cam Chancellor. I know that is an extremely lofty comparison of sorts to be making, but that's the kind of player we are talking about here. And he's also got that swag. He's got that mojo that the Legion of Boom was so famous for in that secondary. This is the kind of player that we are talking about here. And so it's exciting to see him on the field. And, of course, can't wait to see him actually play real football when we get to training camp coming up in late July. When we return, we're going to continue diving into day 2 of mandatory minicamp. Let's talk some offense. We'll get to the offensive side of the football, including some more moving parts on the right side of the line. We'll get to that here in a moment on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode of Locked On Seahawks is brought to you by our friends over at Game Time. You shouldn't have to think about skipping a mortgage payment when you buy your tickets to your next big event. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater near you. They've got killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and with their best price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. My wife surprised me a few weeks ago using Game Time. She got us both tickets to see Metallica at Lumen Field coming up on September 1st. And Metallica doesn't play a lot of shows. It can be a pretty pricey ticket, but we got really nice seats for $250 a piece. That was better than anywhere else on the market looking for Metallica tickets. So we're really excited for that show. Game Time has deals on all the tickets right up to the day of the event, and the Game Time guarantee means you'll always get the best price to write your own memories. If you find tickets in the same section and row for less, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. You're listening to the Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s that are tuning in. Thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN all day? Are you tired of seeing all the shouting and having to turn down the volume? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for your everyday sporting needs with the biggest stories and lacking the screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, Rob, let's continue to break down what is now the final practice of Seahawks mandatory minicamp. It was supposed to be 3 days. Mike Macdonald decided, as the principal of the Seattle Seahawks, to send school out for the summer a day early. I'm sure Rob would love that if that happened at his school. But nonetheless, Mike Macdonald sending everybody away after 2 days, 2 really competitive practices. And you didn't have the wind to deal with near as much today, but this was another practice that was very defensive dominated. And yet at the same time, there's plenty of storylines on the offensive side of the football. And I want to start with the positives here, at least from a health standpoint. Of course, we aren't going to see Abraham Lucas till at least the start of training camp, but Anthony Bradford, back in uniform today, was able to participate in individual and position drills, did not partake in 11-on-11 drills, but still getting to see him back out there. That is certainly a plus, and he needs to get back on the field because it feels like that right side of the line, there's more question marks now, at least at the guard spot, than what there have been even leading into OTAs and mandatory minicamp.
I think there's question marks at right guard, Corbin, but I also think that the answers are on the roster, and that has not always been the case, in my opinion. I think the Seahawks sometimes have had some dudes, or just some guys that are just not really quality NFL caliber starting offensive linemen that they basically just plugged in at the guard positions over the years. I think that has been a recurring theme, unfortunately. I don't think that is the case here. Obviously, we've talked so much about Christian Haynes, so I'm just for the moment going to just acknowledge the fact that right now he's running third team. But Christian Haynes, I believe, is going to just prove himself to be a very capable starter. I just don't know that it's going to happen this year. You mentioned the fact that Anthony Bradford returned. He started 11 games a year ago. He's a big, powerful man who I think is going to fit in nicely in this offense. He was one of the few real tough guys that the Seahawks had on the offensive line a year ago. And again, if that is the mentality that they are going to want to bring to Seattle, and every indication is, then I think that Anthony Bradford definitely still probably should be the favorite to keep that spot at the right guard position. And McClendon Curtis, we've talked about him, name dropped him a little bit, Corbin. I went back and watched a lot of his UT Chattanooga tape, and this is a massive and nimble and aggressive young man, 6'6", 325 pounds. He's got long arms. He's powerful. He's agile. He is an interesting guy. And, he stood out to me when just kind of the eye test yesterday and watching him. And then again, I was encouraged enough to kind of go back and watch his tape before. Some of the snaps that which he played, he's been, again, very, very impressive with just his awareness for such a young player. So very intrigued by him. And then at the right tackle position, obviously, Abraham Lucas is, Seattle starter. If he is healthy, but still the fact that when George Fant went down and the Mike Macdonald kind of said that he was, basically just giving him like a veteran's day off. They're going to manage George Fant, the veterans reps, but still the fact that Raekwon O'Neal was able to kind of slide in. Now, Raekwon O'Neal is a guy that, a lot of Seahawks fans are not going to be very familiar with, of course. He's another undrafted free agent, as was McClendon Curtis mentioned previously. But with Raekwon O'Neal, you're talking about a guy that, played alongside Jake Bobo and Zach Charbonnet at UCLA last couple of years. He was a left tackle at UCLA. He's a little bit shorter, but he's kind of broad and powerful, 6'4", 310 pounds. And he also has some agility to him. So I do definitely think at right tackle, again, it's Abraham Lucas. I think the Seahawks feel very comfortable with George Fant. I thought that he looked good. At least what you can tell on, without the pads being on, but still he looked agile. He looked very focused. And again, Raekwon O'Neal, I think, is showing a little bit as well. So very encouraged by what I saw from there on the right side of the offensive line. And then just quickly, again, we mentioned Jackson Smith and Jig, but the wide receiver who I was most encouraged by is actually Jake Bobo. His ability to just snatch the football out of the air, Corbin, I really think that again, I know that we were talking about offensive line here, but I had to mention him. I kind of gushed about how I thought that Zach Charbonnet looked sleeker. yesterday than I saw him looking at it all at college or at Michigan, at UCLA, or of course with the Seahawks a year ago. Jake Bobo, to me, is the exact same guy that he was before. He is going to catch everything in the zip code that is thrown to him. And, at this point, I think that some of the people are already projecting that he's not going to be able to make this roster. I think it's quite the opposite. I think he's carving out a bigger and bigger role in this new offense.
I'm glad that you transitioned to Jake Bobo, because that is the player that I was most impressed by today. Aside, Jackson Smith and Jigba left early with a banged up shoulder. It's nothing serious. It was just precautionary. They knew they weren't practicing again after this. No reason to have him out there and risk potentially injuring that worse. So he's going to be fine. But Jake Bobo had a couple touchdowns today. One of them, Artie Burns, did not actively try to play the football because he's not supposed to be. So that's something to take with a grain of salt. But he had another touchdown where he shot over the middle of the field, and he's such a big target. And we saw this some of the regular season games last year. He functions almost like a basketball player, a power forward, just boxing guys out. And that's what he does to win contested catches. And he's very, very good at it. And so I can't say the last time. In fact, I don't know that I've ever seen him drop a pass at any of the practices I've been at Seahawks practice, whether it's just tossing off to the side, one-on-ones, team period. I don't know that I've ever seen him drop a pass. The guy is as sure-handed as anybody on this roster. So I'm going to echo what you just said here. I think coming out of this process, and I know there's a few other beat reporters I've talked to about this on the sidelines, that, well, he's got to prove himself to this new coaching staff. And there's truth to that. Pete Carroll and some of those guys, I mean, all those guys, they're not here anymore. The coaches that were so impressed with him last year. But Jake Bobo's got one really big voice in his corner here, and that's Geno Smith. I think if Geno Smith didn't have Jake Bobo on this roster, you'd have a very upset starting quarterback. This is a guy that he trusts. Obviously, with the really soft hands, he knows he's going to get open. He knows he's going to run his routes correctly. Very smart, savvy player. And Geno Smith's been getting him the football plenty during these OTA and minicamp practices. So Geno Smith would certainly be in his corner. And I think Ryan Grubb got a front row seat when Washington played UCLA a couple years ago and got to see Bobo go for over 160 yards with 2 touchdowns against the Huskies defense. So he has seen what this guy can do. He's getting plenty of reps with that first team offense. So I'm not going to sit here and say that he is a given to make the roster, but I'd go 95% at this point. I think you're really looking at 1 or 2 receiver spots open. I don't think that his spot is up for grabs at this point. That's just my opinion, not just from today, just what I've seen, the confidence that Geno Smith has in him, and just the skill set. He's a different style player that really gives you a lot of assets on the football field, including his run blocking, which we aren't seeing right now. And so training camp, he's going to have a chance to do that too. So I think he's very much on this roster, and he was one of the guys that jumped out today.
Yeah, and I love the fact that you mentioned just that he brings a different skill set, because the other receiver or, and return man that I want to kind of transition to is D. Eskridge. And I observed the punt return reps during yesterday's practices, Corbin, and I thought that D. Eskridge looked easily the most comfortable of the 4 players that were returning punts, including D. Williams, an undrafted free agent out of Tennessee that I remain very bullish on, but he struggled with the wind yesterday. And D. Eskridge, because he is a shorter squatter build, he does have that great change of direction and burst to him. Then I do think that he can be kind of that gimmicky type of wide receiver. Now, we all know, anybody who watched University of Washington knows that they had basically the 3-headed monster at the wide receiver position, but they had some other players there. There's going to be some other Husky wide receivers I think are going to continue to excel. And again, that's where I see D. Eskridge as being kind of that other guy, but that guy who can be a little bit of a changeup. And Laviska Shenault has some of those same traits as well. To me, that's going to be one of the fascinating matchups here, fascinating positional battles here. I think it's going to be Laviska Shenault or D. Eskridge. To me, those are the 2 wide receivers who have such a very similar skill set, different body types, of course. Shenault's a much bigger man, but I think that they have the return ability and the ability as on jet sweeps and on quick screens and things like that. That to me is going to be one that's going to be fascinating. And I was impressed by both players during Tuesday's practice.
And I think Derek Young looked pretty good in these 2 days at minicamp. So Honestly, I almost wonder if Derek Young might have more of an inside track to a roster spot because he is just a different style player than what D. Eskridge and Laviska Shenault are. I think there's more deep threat capabilities in Derek Young, and I still wonder if he might get looked at kick return at some point because of the play now being a run style play. It's more like a run play on offense. So this is a very compelling receiver position in terms of competition, but got to wonder if it's those three now that are competing for spots. Again, I'm not going to say I'm 100% sold on Jake Bobo, but I'm pretty close at this point. I feel like he has a spot on this team, and I think there'd be a lot of really upset teammates if Jake Bobo was not on this roster in 2024. Up next, we've already looked at the corners, but there's plenty more to talk about on the defensive side of the football coming out of mandatory minicamp. We're going to have some takeaways coming out of Wednesday's practice on the defensive side of the football. That'll be coming up next here on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. You're listening to the Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s that are listening in. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. The Seahawks wrapping up their 2-day mandatory minicamp. It's not going to be 3 days. Mike McDonald decided to be a nice principal and let school out early for the summer. So we got to wait a while till the Seahawks will be back on the practice field. But plenty of exciting things that happened today at the VMAC. As we discussed early in the show, the cornerbacks took center stage on today's practice with 3 of the 5 interceptions that the Seahawks had. But I want to kind of pivot to the middle of this defense. And we have been discussing, even as recently as yesterday, the concerns at the linebacker spot. You didn't have Tyrell Dodson or Jerome Baker participating this week in minicamp. They haven't participated in OTAs. Maybe they're ready for the start of training camp. There's all kinds of questions at that position. And yet, it feels like coming out of this mini camp, I'm going to say that it's cautious optimism, but it almost feels like maybe there's some positives that we can glean here. And it's not just manufacturing it for the sake of positivity. There's been some tangible evidence on this practice field the last couple of days that there may be some reasons for optimism with this linebacker group.
Yeah, definitely on the outside. I think that everybody is going to be gushing about the return of Uchenna Nwosu and is assuming that we're going to see the steady development of Boye Mafe, Daryl Taylor, et cetera, right? And there's going to be a lot of focus on where Draymond Jones is. And I saw him taking off a lot of reps at that outside linebacker position. So again, we know there's going to be a lot of attention there. But I think that we do need to kind of put the magnifying glass a little bit more on the inside linebackers who are actually playing right now for the Seahawks. And again, everybody is focusing on the other guys, the Tyrell Dodson and Jerome Baker. And of course, they're both coming off of injuries. So, I really wanted to focus in on John Radigan, on Patrick O'Connell, Easton Gibbs, and certainly Tyrese Knight, the one linebacker that the Seahawks actually drafted this year. And I was very encouraged by what I saw from all very different types of players. Let's start with Radigan for a moment here. I mean, 6'1", he's 240 pounds. I mean, this is a guy. 236 is what he's listed at by the Seahawks specifically, but he hits like a 240 plus pounder. He's that kind of classic old school 3-4 inside linebacker guy. He's not an elite athlete. He's going to struggle a little bit in coverage, which is one of the areas in which O'Connell actually, it might surprise some people, the guy out of Montana is actually a dynamic enough athlete that I think that he can handle some coverage ability. I believe that he had one of the interceptions today. I know he had an impressive pass breakup yesterday. Radigan had a great interception as well, and that to me is one of the things that's most intriguing about Radigan. In my opinion, Radigan is heads and shoulders above the other linebackers in this group, but I still think that they are quality linebackers that can make an NFL roster. Radigan, I think, can push for starting reps, and I felt that way watching his tape from last year with the Seahawks against the New York Giants, and I'm trying to think who
the Ravens was the other game that he got.
Yep,
yeah,
exactly. You're absolutely correct there. And so I saw the physicality, the awareness that I think that can allow him to be very successful. Again, with Patrick O'Connell, I think that he's just a smaller guy. I mean, he's 6'1", 225 pounds. He is a little bit more of that coverage linebacker. It's almost like the Seahawks can do something like the Mariners are successfully doing as far as having a little bit of a platoon that they can do there. Tyrese Knight, the rookie, there's going to be some plays where he's looks like a deer lost in the headlights a little bit, but at the same time, you can see the speed and he can tackle. I mean, his tackle numbers are through the roof at UTEP, and that's with the transition, of course, they made from being more of an edge rusher early in his career to playing that off-ball linebacker. And then Easton Gibbs, I mean, he's a pretty interesting athlete himself, who is, again, he's a rookie. There's going to be some confusion there, but still, he is a guy that just plays with his hair on fire, so to speak. And so I was cautiously optimistic with what I saw from the Seattle linebackers. Of course, you don't know anything until they actually allow you to tackle. The linebacker position, that's critical. But I walked in very skeptical of what Seattle might have on the field, linebacker position. I walked out of the VMAC yesterday, Corbin, feeling like this actually might wind up being one of the more dynamic and versatile units that the Seahawks have on defense. That's saying quite a lot.
I'm going to say this right now. As far as players on either side of the football that really changed my perspective on them over the last few weeks, Patrick O'Connell might be at the top of the list right now. And the reason that I'm saying that is people forget when you look at his college career, and yes, it was FCS competition, but Patrick O'Connell actually played as an edge outside linebacker most of his time at Montana. He had a double-digit sack season for the Grizzlies. So we're talking about a guy that's played a number of different roles at a high level, and you mentioned the athleticism, and they list him at 225. I think he's in the low 230s at this point. I think he's gained a little bit of muscle, but as a weak side linebacker, that past pass rushing experience, you can see that. You can see the ability to drop back in coverage. He did not have an interception today, but he had a fantastic pass deflection. This was literally the first play of team drills, 11 on 11, knocked it up in the air, and then Rayshon Jenkins intercepted it. Yesterday, he had 2 pass breakups in practice. So you've seen the pass rushing ability, at least he's shown that in college, that fits a weak side linebacker. The coverage stuff has been really impressive. And then I want to swing over to Tyrese Knight while we're talking positives here. There have been plenty of times that Mike Macdonald, you and I got to see this in yesterday's practice. He got a couple reps with the first team defense, and he was not in the right spot. And this is the way I assumed it, looking at the way that Mike Macdonald reacted. But it was a run play, and Mike Macdonald calmly called him over, and it was an opportunity for him to coach him up, instruction one-on-one. I didn't see him take another snap of the ones the entire rest of the day. I didn't see any snap of the ones today. But you're seeing some of this instruction start to show up on the field, and I will say this. I don't know what Sam Howell was doing on the interception that Tyrese Knight had today. I don't know that there was a receiver in the zip code. There had to be a miscommunication there of some sort, but Tyrese Knight also baited him on that play. Knight took a couple steps forward like he was going to be blitzing and then dropped back into coverage. And I'm just assuming that Sam Howell did not see him and ended up throwing it towards him. And you got to see the really soft hands reaching out and plucking the ball out of the air. And who was the first one to greet him up the sideline? Devon Witherspoon again. And this came literally the play right after Mike Jackson's pick. So they had back-to-back interceptions there in a dominant practice for the defense. But you're seeing baby steps from Tyrese Knight. So I'd be remiss not to mention him as well. But again, it's a cautious optimism. Until we get the pads on, we'll see what happens then. But I have a different impression of this linebacker group. It's steadily getting a little more positive, even without the guys that have been missing. It is getting more positive at this point because you are starting to see some guys that have some of the traits that Mike Macdonald is looking for at that position. If you can mold traits, that's part of the key as an NFL coach.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And let's be real. I mean, the linebacker crew is only going to be as good as the defensive line ahead of them. And the fact that the Seahawks are as big and as diverse as they are along the defensive line, I think it's going to make it relatively easy for Seattle's linebackers to eat in 2024.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Rob, because those guys up front, we've been talking so much about the big plays that we think that this group can make. Tackles for loss, sacks, pressures. But at the end of the day, run defense particularly, your linebackers have to be kept clean. So if your defensive line is able to do that and the guys that are getting double teams are able to hold up at the point of attack, then you can't have a linebacker have a lineman climb up to it. And so that's been a big issue for this football team the last couple of seasons. If the D-line can really improve upon that and keep these linebackers clean, you have a number of guys that can really run and find the football and make plays that are clean tacklers here. And we have yet to see, obviously, the two projected starters. We'll see where Baker and Dodson fit in when we get to training camp. But I will just say this, I'm a little more optimistic. There's still question marks there. There's no question about it. We'll see how they look in real football situations. But I think that there's maybe a little bit more reason for optimism at this point with what we've seen. OTA is now going to minicamp with some of these guys clearly taking to the coaching they're getting from not just Mike McDonald, but Kirk Olivadotti as well, the longtime inside linebacker coach that came over as part of Seattle's staff. I think you're starting to see that come together a little bit. And you've got some really heady linebackers there. And you've got a guy with a lot of twitch and traits in Tyrese Knight that is coming along as well. So there's a lot of reasons to be excited about the potential there for a few of those guys to maybe exceed expectations this year for the Seahawks. As always, you can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. Coming up on tomorrow's show, we won't have a minicamp practice to break down, but we've got plenty still to talk about. Rob and I are going to be diving into what we learned this offseason on offense, defense, special teams as we head into the dead period 6 weeks away from training camp. Make sure that you're listening in, and thanks for tuning in to our Wednesday episode. Go Hawks.